Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Anxiety, Fear, and Resilience, How to Optimize the Cortisol Awakening Response. My name is Amy Paoletti, and I'm a member of the Dutch Education and Marketing team, and I'd like to thank you all for taking the time to be with us today. The COVID-19 pandemic has rapidly changed how many of us live, work, and learn. The new normal of this worldwide public health emergency, coupled with the guidance around physical distancing, also makes this a trying time for clinicians and patients. At Precision Analytical, the health and safety of you, our customers, as well as our employees, are our top priorities. We have put plans in place across all departments to ensure day-to-day business continues to run safely and with the highest quality of service and dependability. We know many of you are now operating your clinical services virtually, and we realize patient care is your #1 priority and testing plays a vital role. Above all, we know this is a time for resilience and perseverance for all of us. I wanted to go over a few housekeeping items before Dr. Jones starts. Wanted to let everybody know we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end of the webinar. You can send all your questions in the questions section on the side panel of your screen. If you miss anything, please do not worry. We will be sending this on-demand recording to all of you tomorrow, along with the presentation slides. Once again, stress and resilience are among the key topics Dr. Jones will be discussing today. She will introduce the importance of the cortisol awakening response, how this measurement gives you more insight into the HPA-Axis dysfunction compared to most traditional cortisol testing. Dr. Jones will also explain how understanding a dysfunctional CAR response relates to symptoms of anxiety, fatigue, inflammation, and autoimmunity, as well cover case studies and treatment options. Many of us today are probably familiar with Dr. Jones. In case you're not, Dr. Jones is the medical director for Precision Analytical. She is also a naturopathic doctor whose passion and expertise lies in the areas of hormonal, adrenal, and thyroid health. Dr. Jones graduated from the National University of Natural Medicine in Portland, Oregon, and went on to complete her residency in women's health, endocrinology, and hormones. She later graduated from the Grand Canyon University with Masters in Public Health. Please welcome Dr. Jones.
Thank you so much, Amy. Just want to make sure that you can hear me. Everyone can hear me. Before we launch into 140 some slides over the course of the next hour. So as Amy said, we're going to cover anxiety, fear, and resilience, how to optimize the cortisol awakening response to survive and thrive. We often at Dutch talk about the cortisol awakening response and resiliency. And of course, given the situation right now, this is very, very timely. So let's go ahead and dive in. So it's a two-part in the next hour. So part one is the what, the why, and the where. And then the next part, part two, is the how, right? We're going to walk through all of the physiology of everything. And then in the second part, we're going to talk about how you can address yourself and how you can address your patients and clients. We are Precision Analytical. We are going to talk about Dutch test as we move through this. And I just want to do a quick little summary in the beginning of the webinar. So most of you, if you've run a Dutch test before, you're familiar with the Dutch Complete. Now, Dutch is an acronym. It stands for Dried Urine Test for Comprehensive Hormones. So it is 4 to 5 dried urine collections on the little filter paper that you can see the collection devices on the screen if you're watching on the webinar. And what we do when we look at these through urine is we get this whole list: progesterone metabolites, androgens, and androgen metabolites such as 5-alpha DHT. We get your estrone, your estradiol, your estriol. We do get your phase 1 and phase 2 estrogen metabolism. So we do look at your 2, your 4, your 16, and your methoxy for estrogen. We do look at metabolized cortisol, which is a rough idea of your total cortisol output and metabolism for the day. We do look at free cortisol and free cortisone. Of course, cortisone is inactive. We do an overnight cortisol sample, and then we do show you the diurnal pattern that your patient or yourself has through the day. We look at some organic acid markers, MMA, methylmalonate for B12, specifically adenylyl B12, kynurenate and xanthurenate for B6, and of course they respond to other things. Pyroglutamate is a glutathione indicator, and then the 2 neurotransmitter metabolites, HVA and VMA, HVA for dopamine and VMA for epinephrine and norepinephrine. And these are metabolites. These are, of course, not the direct neurotransmitter themselves. And lastly, we look at 8-OHDG, 8-hydroxy-2-deoxyguanosine, which is a well-studied marker in the research looking at DNA damage. Now, what we're going to focus on today, though, is the cortisol awakening response, which you get in the Dutch Plus. So for those of you who, again, who are not familiar with Dutch or maybe are only familiar with the complete, we do offer a combination of dried urine and saliva. So it's everything I said in the last slide, plus we offer in the cortisol awakening response. Now, before you ask, what is the cortisol awakening response? Don't worry, when we get to the how portion, we will go through this in detail. So it's a lot of information, a lot of data points from a lot of collection, but it's easy to do right at home. Now, for those of you who maybe are only familiar with saliva or are wondering what we or how we do urine testing when it comes to cortisol, since that's going to be a lot of our focus, this is data that is to be published. We're hoping to get this published this year in 2020, comparing dried urine to salivary cortisol results. And you can see there is a statistical equivalence between the rise and fall in saliva and the rise and fall in urine for free cortisol throughout the day. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, it's shifted. It is shifted a little bit because with urine, it gets made and put in the bladder and stored, so to speak, until you urinate it out. So in this example, the waking cortisol is a little bit lower because that's the cortisol that's made through the night and stored in the bladder, whereas saliva tells you in that exact moment, similar to a blood draw. The 2 hours after waking, which is the second on the straight line, it's the second point, that's the cortisol, all the cortisol that you make and that goes through the kidney and into the bladder for until 2 hours later, and then you do your second collection. So the rise and fall pattern is statistically equivalent. It is just shifted a little bit because of the way urine works as opposed to the way cortisol works. But what we're going to focus on today is the salivary part, because we want to focus on that first part in the morning, the cortisol awakening response. So as Amy said in the beginning, we are going to talk about hormones and how that relates to anxiety, fear, hypervigilance, panic, what it can lead to, the comorbidities and sequelae that are going to happen in the future, what you as healthcare practitioners need to be watching out for, not only this year, but for the years to come, and then how you can treat it. For many of you, this feels really pretty familiar. If we just called that T-Rex, if we just named that T-Rex Rona right now, I mean, that pretty much sums up what's going on. In addition, we can throw in the fact that many healthcare practitioners are moving to telemedicine from brick and mortar. Many people have lost their job. They're now doing homeschooling. Kids are out of school until maybe till April, the end of April, June. Some schools are out until the end of until September of next year. There's a lot going on in the world right now. And a lot of people are feeling this T-Rex looming over their shoulder. So don't panic, let's just cover some basics. And I want to explain again, right, the what, the why, and the where. So we have the central fight, flight, freeze response. Everyone's familiar with fight or flight. Please keep in mind that they have now, and we know now that freeze is a common response. So step one is the initiation of the response. You get the sensory nerve cells at literally anywhere in the body, pass the information over to the hypothalamus in the brain, whether it's inside the body or outside of the body, it doesn't matter, it all goes to the hypothalamus. So that from the hypothalamus releases CRH over to the anterior pituitary, releasing ACTH, which goes down to the adrenals and releases aldosterone, DHEA, DHEAS, and of course, cortisol, which is what we're going to focus on. In addition, and much, much faster, you can get your catecholamine release, your norepinephrine and epinephrine release out of the adrenal medulla through sympathetic signaling. Now, as you know, the norepinephrine and epinephrine hormones are made and stored for immediate release. Cortisol is a little slower. Cortisol takes about 10 minutes-ish to be made. So when you have a fright, when you get a stressful situation, what's reacting immediately are your catecholamines. Cortisol does come, it just comes a little bit later. Your catecholamines are degraded really pretty quickly. They're degraded by COMT and MAO. Unless you have issues with COMT and MAO, then these are degraded really rapidly or they're degraded really slowly. Cortisol is degraded a little bit differently. It's degraded through an enzyme 5-alpha reductase or 5-beta reductase, and that takes longer. That's more like, and depending on what research you read, more like an hour to break down your cortisol. So they get released in different stages and they get broken down in different stages, but they're both very, very important. And the problem is that when you get this release of catecholamines and of cortisol, right, the HPA-Axis from the brain down runs to the adrenals to dump it out instead of going to the neocortex for logical processing. And for many people right now, it's resulting in a freak out, and of course, freak out is a scientific term, and illogical processing. Because what happens is you get this overwhelming fear of stress, stressed out, anxiety, panic, nervousness, when maybe if your neocortex came into play, it might say like, whoa, 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 calm down. This is not something we need to freak out about. This is something we can process. This is something we can work through together. Now, it is a good thing in the end that our brain runs to the adrenals and causes a fight, flight, freeze reaction, because the point is to save our backside if we come across something scary. If you come across a tiger while going on a walk, if your brain ran to the neocortex for logical processing, you overthinkers might think to yourself, you know what, I like cats. This is fine. This is just a big cat. I'm great with cats. In fact, I have 2 cats at home. This tiger is not going to be a problem. But thankfully, your HPA goes right from the brain to the adrenals, so you get this signal to run. That is a tiger in front of you. However, when it gets to the extreme, when it gets too much, which we're going to talk about, this is when the illogical processing happens. There are other neurotransmitters involved. A lot goes into anxiety, fear, hypervigilance, panic. I fully realize that. We are going to cover just sort of the tip of the iceberg to give you an idea in an hour of what's going on. So we're going to talk about glutamate here for a second. Glutamate, of course, is your main excitatory neurotransmitter. It's extremely important for executive function. It stimulates brain activity, cognitive function, and behavior. About 85% of your glutamate is converted to glutamine and then reused, which I will show you in just a second. Glutamate gets a bad rap because it's often associated with excitotoxicity, or the killing of cells in the brain. Except we need it. It's our primary excitatory neurotransmitter. For you to listen to this webinar right now, your glutamate is going crazy. It's trying really hard to keep up with all the thinking and the remembering and the note-taking, typing that you're doing for this webinar. But if you have too much, it's like Goldilocks. If you have too much, then it results in excitotoxicity, and we don't want that. Now, counter to glutamate is your main inhibitory neurotransmitter, known as GABA. This is important for relaxation. It reduces anxiety, helps with sleep when it's at the appropriate levels. Interestingly, a lot of people feel that GABA, the supplement, is a large molecule and therefore should not be able to cross the blood-brain barrier. And if you take GABA and you feel more relaxed, that could be an indicator that you have a leaky, quote unquote, leaky blood-brain barrier. There's some research, and I have it listed there, that actually they're questioning this, and they're suspecting that when you take GABA, the supplement, that it's actually activating the enteric nervous system that's stimulating the CNS to make GABA through the vagus nerve. So basically, the supplement is it's like telephone, right? Or a domino effect. The supplement is actually telling through the vagus nerve and the enteric nervous system, like, hey, would you tell the brain to make GABA? And then the brain does. So for a lot of people with GABA working, it may be leaky blood-brain barrier, or it may be the vagus nerve communicating that more GABA from the brain needs to be made. Here is the cycle between glutamate and glutamine. So in the blue is the astrocyte, and in the orange is the neuron. It starts at the top with glucose. This is really, really important, especially as women get older and move into perimenopause and menopause and experience a lot of brain fog, and maybe even, of course, those who are experiencing dementia. If you've read any of Dr. Lisa Moscani's work, she's a neuroscientist who studies the female brain. She talks a lot about how it's the inability for women to use glucose appropriately as they get older in their brain. And as a result, they don't make glutamate appropriately. This leads to their brain fog. And the reason they feel like they have to write everything down, and they can't multitask anymore, and they can't remember things like they used to. But it can happen to anyone who has glucose issues. Think about being hypoglycemic. Think about being in a hangry state, right? Like, can you remember? Can you think? Can you learn? Not very well. So glucose is really important for this. Then you come down to the bottom where you make glutamate and glutamine in the cycle that goes back and forth. And out of glutamate, you do make GABA. So if we move on to how you make GABA and how is it recycled, you use GAD, your glutamate decarboxylase, which also, of course, is important for in the pancreas and a type of diabetes. And but here it's in the brain for making GABA, and vitamin B6, really important for making GABA. So why is it important to talk about all of these hormones? Why did I pick cortisol, norepinephrine, epinephrine, glutamate, and GABA? Well, it's really important because anxiety, vigilance, stress, fear, as you know, as you probably experience, are running really high right now. And this is possibly or probably leading to long-term sequelae. So everyone's concerned about the now. We see it in the news. We see it in our newsletters. We see it in social media, where people are giving examples or advice or suggestions on how to stay present, how to reduce anxiety now, how to help stress now, how to reduce fear now. And we're focused on the now, which is 100% what we should be doing, because what's going to happen if we don't is it can lead to these long-term sequelae. We know from the past, people who were quarantined during the SARS outbreak in Toronto in this research study experienced higher psychological distress such as depression and PTSD afterwards. After natural disasters, depression, anxiety, PTSD, and substance abuse increases. Think of things like Katrina, think of like hurricanes, think of tornadoes, not hurricanes. Well, Katrina's the hurricane. Think of like tornadoes, think of earthquakes. After the 2008 stock market crash, it resulted in a spike in suicide among men in America and throughout Europe. Job loss, loss of insurance is associated with worsening mental health, increased stress, insomnia, worse well-being, and health decline. And Ebola in Africa, the studies on Ebola, if you just search the repercussions of Ebola in Africa, just on the survivors, it's understandably resulted in similar, if not worse, outcomes and on their mental health, on their physical health, and what they have had to work through. So right now, the world is struggling with illness. It's struggling with separation, social isolation, financial insecurity, bereavement, and death that will lead to a fallout with chronic conditions. And that's why I wanted to really pull this webinar together, because you are going to be on the front lines of handling the chronic conditions that come out on the other end. You're currently on the front lines of helping people, guide them through ways to reduce their anxiety and fear and stress and improve their sleep and give them coping mechanisms. But eventually you're also going to be working with chronic conditions as a result of this. You're going to be asking your patients and your clients in the future, tell me about what the coronavirus in 2020 was like for you. That's going to start to be on your intake form. It's going to start to be on your, the way you discuss health with your patients, because it's global, it's worldwide, it's affecting all of us. Just like the people who live in Louisiana who went through Katrina, it's one of their questions that they ask. Tell me about what it was like when you lived through Katrina. Tell me how that was for you, because it has such an impact. So how do these sequelae occur? Well, first they impact the amygdala. Now, a lot goes in the brain. It's very complex and comprehensive when it comes to fear, anxiety, panic, stress, what have you. But I'm just going to focus on the amygdala today because it's an interesting little gland and I have an hour. So with the amygdala, it has a huge role in emotion-based memory processing. Emotion-based, and everybody is emotional right now. So fear, anxiety-related emotions, and PTSD are running at an all-time high thanks to the amygdala. Now, the amygdala is also really important for emotional intelligence. It's really important for social interaction, including personal space, which we're all kind of struggling with right now. Modulation of aggression, which I think a lot of people are struggling with right now, and alcoholism and binge drinking, which again, a lot of people are struggling with right now. That amygdala is getting lit up all over the place. It is located in the temporal lobes, and it's at the end of a lot, because the hippocampus is basically delegating the emotion-based response to the amygdala to handle it when scary things happen. The amygdala also has a major influence on the HPA-axis and on the gut-brain axis, which we don't have time to get in today, but if you PubMed search, amygdala and gut-brain axis, it's really interesting, which makes complete sense how a lot of our, we call the gut the second brain, and how they go back and forth. We need the amygdala. We want the amygdala. We want to feel fear to heighten our awareness and protect ourselves. If you are out in a forest and it becomes misty and this scary, ghoulish looking guy pops up, I would hope your hypothalamus would say to your amygdala, like, hey, this is a flight situation, you need to run right now, and you would take off. Just like I gave the example earlier of logical processing and coming across a tiger, if you come across a tiger, your amygdala is going to tell you to run. It's a healthy response. You need to feel fear to heighten your awareness. The problem, though, with the amygdala is that it gets really sensitized early in life. So ACEs are adverse childhood events. And when we are vulnerable to stressors early in life, it makes us it increases our sensitivity to stress as an adult. So for many of you and many of your patients who had ACEs growing up, they're already in your office with an increased sensitivity to stress. They know that compared to the average person. We know with childhood trauma, it's a major risk factor for development of mood and anxiety disorders, certain medical diseases like heart disease, and disorders such as chronic fatigue and pain syndromes. We see this all the time in our practices. Childhood trauma really affects the HPA-Axis. It affects the way the prefrontal cortex acts for control over the HPA. It affects the feedback loop in cortisol. There's a natural feedback loop when your cortisol is too high. It should feed back and tell the brain to tell the adrenals to stop making as much, to slow it down. Some people have an increased sensitivity. Other people lose sensitivity. Anytime you have hippocampal atrophy, of which trauma can be one reason, you get a lower cortisol awakening response, which we're going to talk about. And of course, you get a heightened emotion-based response because of that amygdala. Why is this so important? Because we need to pay attention to our kids now. Many of you are probably on this webinar because you primarily see adults. But remember that the kids now in 2020, our children, are going to be adults not that much further off, right? And they're going to show up in your office as teenagers, as 20-year-olds, eventually, right, as 30, 40-year-olds, depending on how old you are, and they're going to be struggling. And you're going to turn back and you're going to ask them about childhood trauma. But in this case of what's going on right now, what happened for you during the coronavirus in 2020? Did you get sick? Did your parents get sick? What was it like when your school got canceled? What happened when you had to miss all of your sporting events? Prom, you couldn't go to graduation. What happened when your grandparents died because of the coronavirus? This is a lot for everybody right now. And our kids are the future that are coming into our office with these long-term sequelae of health issues. So over time, the constant stream of these hormones cause the amygdala to fire off fear-based emotions really rapidly. This results in more anxiety, more PTSD, fear, hypervigilance, and aggression than the situation likely calls for, and unfortunately, it can be really lasting. It's plasticity, right? Fear-based emotions becomes the default response. The amygdala doesn't know any better. It keeps getting hammered all day long with hormones that are telling it to freak out and to fire quickly. The amygdala is not going to, it's not getting conditioned to fire off happy emotions. It's not getting conditioned to fire off joy and kindness and love. It's unfortunately firing off anxiety, and it's firing off fear and aggression and all those kinds of emotions. And so it becomes again like the default trigger response for a lot of people. But thankfully, we can do stuff to help it. Second, when all these hormones come flying at the body, right, it can lead to an increase in everyday cortisol production, and specifically in the cortisol awakening response. Unfortunately, though, because of that feedback loop, over time, the negative feedback part kicks in and it results in lower cortisol production. So you may see people in various stages of this feedback loop. You may see people who initially come into you with high cortisol. High cortisol symptoms, right? They're like can't sleep, they're ramped up, they're anxious, they're gaining weight in the middle section. Their blood pressure is high, right? They're losing their hair, their skin is aging, all of these things, their blood sugar is a mess. All of these can be a result of cortisol. Then later, you may be seeing patients who have gone through the whole high cortisol part and now they're at the low cortisol part. The feedback loop is kicked in. So when they see you, they're now experiencing issues with autoimmune disease and inflammation and infection and fatigue and exhaustion and burnout because they don't have the proper cortisol response to combat all of these. And if you forget what that cortisol feedback loop looks like, you've got cortisol on the bottom and it feeds back to the hypothalamus. It also feeds back to the pituitary to turn it off. And as a result, your cortisol production goes down. So you may be encountering people at any stage of this. Your patients are going to start to ask you, why can't I handle stress like I used to? I don't understand. And it's the concept of resiliency, which is the whole point of this webinar. We want you to be resilient. Do you have the flexibility or adaptability to survive your environment? That's resiliency. With an acute stress, you should be able to rebound. If you have an acute stress, let's say you go out to go to the store, but obviously you're, gloved up and staying 6 feet from each other. You go out to go to the store and your car has a flat tire, mild stressor. You get a sympathetic stress reaction, but you start moving. You're like, you know what? I can either change the tire. I can take my other car because my partner is working from home too, so I'll just borrow that car instead. You can, brave it and choose to take an Uber right now, but in the future, like usually not a problem. And you go to the store and you come home. You deal with your flat tire, parasympathetic rebound, and everything returns back to normal. Pain in the butt, you post about it on social media. My day was crazy, had a flat tire, but you get over it. Unfortunately, with acute stress, you get a chronic stress response. So you get this chronic ongoing stress response. You get a strong sympathetic stress reaction. Unfortunately, you have a breakdown in a lot of the systems that are supposed to help you recover, including a diminished vagal tone, and you fail to recover to normal. And so you always sort of live in this fight or flight or freeze state off and on or very easily as time goes on. So this is important because the less flexible the whole body is, or the slower the system is to adapt, then the less able to survive and thrive in an environment. And our whole goal, regardless of what's happening right now, is to survive and thrive in our environment. And if I asked for a show of hands, you don't have to, don't flood the comments, but if you think to yourself, even prior to the coronavirus, was I surviving and thriving in my environment, or was I just barely getting by? And when I ask this question, it's especially to healthcare practitioners, it's amazing the number of practitioners who report to me that they're not thriving, they're barely surviving when it comes to their environment. Their resiliency has gone down, and we need to address that. So as I was saying earlier, all of this can lead to a dysfunction. So with an elevated response, I'm going to give you some examples. So if you have high cortisol, high catecholamines, high glutamate, and not enough GABA, you're more prone to mood disorders such as melancholic depression. Melancholic depression is when you have depression specifically more related in the morning. So your patients will often say to you, I'm depressed, and you say, are you depressed all day or a particular part of day? And they go, well, I wake up with depression. I wake up with depression. And the big reason for that is cortisol driven. Cortisol will turn tryptophan that is normally going down the serotonin pathway, and it will turn it and push it more down the kynurenine pathway. So it'll just shift tryptophan away from making serotonin, which is one of the reasons they feel like melancholic depression happens. And because our cortisol goes up the highest in the morning, or it should, that's what happens. If we get this excessive response of cortisol, then we get a decreased production of natural serotonin. Anxiety, panic attacks, hypervigilance, and aggression. Stress disorders, feeling stressed out, feeling overwhelmed, insomnia, of course, cardiovascular dysfunction, high blood pressure, coronary artery disease, and metabolic dysfunction, diabetes, insulin resistance, and metabolic syndrome. In addition, we have brain function. We know that high glutamate and cortisol will kill hippocampal cells and lead to memory issues. We know glutamate can lead to what's called, quote, brain on fire, which is the excitotoxicity that happens in the brain. Reproductive dysfunction. With high cortisol and high catecholamines, we know that ovulatory issues and fertility issues are aplenty. And the reason for this is that when the cortisol and the catecholamines, your epinephrine and norepinephrine, communicate up to the brain, like we are stressed out, we have a problem, and the brain says, okay, we need to protect her reproduction, so I'm going to throw everything off right now, and I'm going to decrease the GnRH pulses, which will decrease LH pulses, which therefore leads to a lack or poor ovulation, and then a lack or poor production of progesterone, and then it will lead to a slow, it'll slow the pulses of FSH, which will slow estrogen production from the follicles. So for people, for women right now, with a lot of stress and a lot of anxiety, and they're saying to you, I'm not ovulating, my cycle was late, my cycle was early, I completely skipped my cycle this month, my PMS was terrible, my period was really heavy, my endometriosis was the worst it's been in a long time. My PCOS is the worst it's been in a long time. I don't understand why. This is one area to consider, that cortisol and catecholamines tell the brain to slow down the pulses. This isn't a stealing issue. A lot of people talk about like progesterone steals. This isn't a stealing issue. This is a pulse decrease issue. GnRH decreases, LH decreases, FSH decreases. GI symptoms. We know with stress, it increases the risk for dysbiosis, intestinal permeability, and irritable bowel syndrome. Now, what happens over time is cortisol drops down, your catecholamines drop down, your glutamate drops down, and of course your GABA's are always been kind of low. Now we have atypical depression. They're more depressed, lethargic, not motivated through the day. PTSD, seasonal affective disorder, and anxiety. And specifically with anxiety, we know because the loss of GABA, and then they just sort of feel blah all around. Burnout, they're less resilient. They have insomnia, again, not because of cortisol or glutamate, because of the inability to produce enough GABA. Immune dysfunction. Well, we need cortisol, right? We need these hormones to help fight infection and combat inflammation and to deal with autoimmune. The cortisol awakening response in the morning is a big player for helping you kill your T cells that have failed central tolerance to reduce your risk for autoimmune. So when your T cells are going through maturation, they go to the thymus gland, not thyroid, but thymus, and they get run through basically all the tissues you have in your body. It's called central tolerance. And if any of your T cells are accidentally created as reactive to something in your body, let's say thyroid, it's a T cell, it's reactive against your thyroid, so Hashimoto's is an example, then they get pulled aside. The thymus gland goes, no, you failed central tolerance, we can't send you out, you have to get destroyed. And one of the big triggers for destroying that cell is the rise in cortisol in the morning through the cortisol awakening response. So when people have autoimmune issues and they tell me they're really tired in the morning and they can't get out of bed and they need 10 cups of coffee, and oh, by the way, their autoimmune symptoms are worse, I strongly suspect cortisol is at play because their spike in cortisol is not where it needs to be. With metabolic dysfunction, we're looking at things like hypoglycemia, right? Dysglycemia, because you have a low cortisol response. Remember, cortisol is a glucocorticosteroid. Because glucose is the thing cortisol is supposed to work on the most. If you can't get your glucose right, you'll never get your cortisol right, ever. It's also called cortico because it's made in the cortex of the adrenal glands, and steroid because it is steroid hormone with cholesterol as its backbone. Brain dysfunction, memory and recall. We know the cortisol awakening response has a lot to do with laying down memory and recall, specifically the next day. So for those of you listening to this webinar, if tomorrow you're thinking to yourself, what was it that she said? It's entirely possible. You don't have enough cortisol to lay down that memory for recall. And it can contribute to brain fog, but just in a different manner than high glutamate. Reproductive dysfunction, again, possibly from perceived burnout, over time. And then cancer outcomes, those with lower cortisol awakening response, specifically a flat cortisol curve in general, have an earlier mortality if diagnosed with breast and prostate cancer. We want that healthy, spiked circadian rhythm in the morning that goes down through the rest of the day. So improving a dysfunctional stress response can reduce these comorbidities. And I'm sure by now, several of you are thinking, well, this webinar has now made me anxious and hypervigilant and fearful. Thank you so much for that. But I want you to know that we're about to move into the how part. The how part is much more, like exciting and robust. And this quote really struck me, which is why I put it in the webinar. I just love it so much. In the darkness, any amount of light we can shine will be brighter than it ever would be otherwise. So you, healthcare practitioners, are the light, any amount of light, because a lot of people are experiencing darkness right now. And it's your job to go out there and educate and serve and help and heal. So let's do that. Let's move into the how. So how are people being managed traditionally? Of course, they're being managed through therapy, which big fan, and thankfully so many therapy organizations right now have moved to online and have online options. And of course, a lot of the a lot of the hotlines, like the suicide hotline and depression and whatnot, have textability, so you can actually text and reach out. But the other way they're being managed traditionally, anxiolytics, right? Oh, you have anxiety, here's Xanax, antidepressants, sleep medications, antihypertensive and other heart medications, blood sugar and insulin medications, etc. Unfortunately, with conventional medicine, they don't often have enough time to fully evaluate, like, well, you're anxious because, and especially in the future, right? Oh, you have high blood pressure. I'm going to put you on this high blood pressure medication. And they don't have the time to go back into the history to find out maybe what are the big triggers for their high blood pressure, right? Their blood sugar dysregulation. And so they just get put on medication. Now, I'm not dismissing at all these medications. These medications save lives. If you have a suicidal patient and you need to put them on an anxiolytic and an antidepressant and to cope with their day-to-day, do it. That's fine. But what I'm going to offer you in the remaining slides are just other more functional approaches that can just help as adjunct or as first-line therapy, depending on the person. So be aware, a lot of people are going to be on these medications, and you're still going to tie it back to their stress, anxiety, and fear response, especially given the situation. So how is stress typically assessed? Well, in traditional endocrinology, we have this model. The model says when we're looking at cortisol, everything is normal unless you have Cushing's on the far extreme or unless you have Addison's in the far extreme. And what I'm going to propose to you, and I think a lot of you already believe in, which is wonderful, is that it's a lot more fluid than that. We call it the functional endocrinology model, where where it goes up and down, right? Where there's the normal isn't all normal until you hit an actual disease state, where cortisol can be adaptive, where these hormones can shift and change, and that's what we're going to talk about. So the traditional 4-point collection, whether it's through saliva or through urine, looks like this, of course. You collect in the morning. You either collect 2 hours later or around lunch, depending on the test you're using. You collect in the afternoon, and you collect at night. You do this, like I said, you can do this on the Dutch Complete. You can do this in saliva testing. In blood, it's often really difficult because nobody wants their blood drawn 4 times a day. But is this enough information now? Is that 4-point cortisol good enough? It turns out we should probably start adding in the cortisol awakening response. The CAR, the cortisol awakening response, is specifically being used as one marker to determine resilience and flexibility. And in a study, they said it's been repeatedly suggested that the CAR can be a result of the anticipated demands of the upcoming day and could support coping with daily life stress. And like I said earlier, it also helps cope with infection, inflammation, autoimmune, mood, energy and alertness, and so much more. So how does the CAR work differently than your traditional sort of grand sweeping 4-point through the day? Well, the CAR works off of light. So as you're getting closer to wake up in the morning, your brain is sending ACTH down to your adrenals, and the pituitary is basically like, now, can we do it now? Now, can you make cortisol now? And the adrenals go, not yet, not yet, not yet. They're not awake yet, not yet. So they have a blunting effect. When you open your eyes and light enters, the blunting releases, ACTH binds, and your cortisol gets produced, and you switch from conscious to alert. In that first 30 minutes, your cortisol rises about 50% or more, at least 50%. It's a very sharp intake because you want your body in about 30 minutes to be at a full alertness to start your day, to get yourself out of bed, to get you going, and of course, you know, to forage for food and to protect yourself if you need to. And then cortisol should gradually decline throughout the day. So the big question is, can you make the switch? When you rapid consciousness is when you open your eyes, you register that yes, you're awake, and roughly 30 minutes later, you're full alert and ready to go. So the question I ask all the time is, do you feel alert and ready to go in the morning? And if you say to me, yeah, sure, after about 2 hours and 2 cups of coffee, I'm pretty alert. Well, 2 hours is that's not cutting it. I know that your cortisol awakening response is not that healthy. Other people will say, I'm too alert. I wake up anxious, hypervigilant, ready to go, like fight or flight, like on edge. And I know that you have an over-responsive cortisol awakening response. So how is the CAR measured? The CAR is measured in 5 collections total through the day, but specifically, it's 3 in the morning that we focus on. It's a little different than what many of you are used to if this is the kind of testing you're familiar with. So you collect immediately on waking. You collect 30 minutes later because I need to see if you spike and what your alertness is. And you collect 30 minutes after that. So waking 30-30 or 60 minutes after your waking point. You do collect around dinner and at bed, and there is an optional insomnia sample in the Dutch Plus. So for your patients who say, well, I can't sleep and I struggle in the morning with symptoms, we've got you covered. We cover you on both ends. It is really important, we feel, that the dinner and bedtime sample are collected because you do want that overall circadian rhythm. I want to know, especially for those who can't fall asleep, can't stay asleep, you know, they're struggling in the evening, they have afternoon fatigue. I really want to see what's going on with that. So I do like the Dutch Plus that it covers that whole span and still gives you the middle of the night sample for those who wake up and can't fall asleep. The Dutch Plus does use Salivette swabs as opposed to having to drool or spit into saliva tubes. So the Salivette swabs are just what you think and what they look like in the picture. They're kind of like these cotton swabs that you pop in your mouth. You get them wet and you pop them right back into the tube in less than 5 minutes. So it's convenient for those who have dry mouth. It's convenient, especially in the morning when you can't drink water or brush your teeth. You're not, you're supposed to just get up and collect. And the Salivettes are used in nearly all published CAR studies, which apparently I thought was so important, I wrote it twice. Apologize for that. As opposed to the tubes take longer to collect. They do require that you have enough saliva production in the morning to fill a tube up or to drool into a tube. And some companies do advise you to rinse your mouth with water prior to the collection, which does introduce the idea of dilution. You have to be careful, and you have to collect immediately on waking. So if you have to get up and rinse out your mouth, and then you have to wait a little bit so that your own saliva forms, and then you can spit in the tube, then it's a little bit late. So with Dutch, like I said, we do use the Salivette swabs to make it really easy and convenient. And man, the people with dry mouth, especially in the morning, it's like the greatest thing. It's so easy. And the collection is less than 5 minutes. It's you pop it in your mouth, get it wet, pop it back in the tube. If it takes you a long time to drool into a saliva tube, if you're taking 15, 20, 30 minutes, unfortunately, then you've missed the point of the cortisol awakening response because it's waking, collection, 30 minutes later, collection, 30 minutes after that, collection. So just keep that in mind. With the Dutch Plus, like I said at the beginning, we do also offer all the metabolites. So we do look at your cortisol metabolites, we look at your estrogen metabolites, progesterone metabolites, androgens like DHEAS and testosterone and their metabolites. We do report cortisone, which we're not going to talk about in this webinar just because of time, but cortisone is very important as it's inactive. And we do report the organic acids, though, VMA, and VMA is vinyl mandalate, which is the norepinephrine epinephrine marker, and when it's elevated, as a case in this example, it could indicate that they do have peripheral elevation of epinephrine and epinephrine. Now, norepinephrine and epinephrine. It's not an absolute. It is not a neurotransmitter marker from the brain, right? It's a peripheral look, but it does help tell the story further. If they say, I have anxiety, I have fear, I can't sleep, I feel on edge, and their cortisol is high and their VMA is high, you would start to suspect, oh, okay, I think your entire HPA-Axis is on fire. We do offer the CAR by itself. It is 5 data points total, plus the insomnia sample if they want it. It does not include the metabolites though. And so if you're just looking for the cortisol awakening response and no other information, we do have that at Dutch, but the Dutch Plus really offers everything. When you're looking at the cortisol awakening response, you want to be very cognizant of the rise, the percent change in the numbers. How, do you rise up too high? Do you flatline? You want to look at your actual numbers and you want to see if they're in the reference range. So these are 3 things you're looking at when evaluating a CAR. The reason for this is that they might have a cortisol awakening response, but they're below the reference range. So they can do it, but not strong enough. They need some more oomph to get their CAR up there. And other people, again, like they have a CAR, but it's above the reference range. They do it just way too much, way too much gas on the gas, or pressure on the gas pedal. Like we need to slow it down a little bit to help their symptoms. So when you're looking at the whole curve, this is what it looks like. It's hyper-focused in the morning, waking plus 30, waking plus 60, and then the afternoon and night. So let's jump into CAR patterns and treatment. This is the most important part of everything. This is the big how. So how you've tested, right? You've done the Dutch Plus, you've looked at the cortisol awakening response. You're first going to assume in all of this that Cushing's and Addison's has been ruled out. So if everything's really high and flat or very low and flat, then please do your due diligence and rule out these 2 conditions. But once you've done that, let's look at some examples. So both of these examples are healthcare practitioners that have given me permission to show their results. The person on the left is a practitioner who runs a very busy practice, who has a family, who has employees, right, who had all the things, and said to me, I wake up in the morning and I go from 0 to 10. I wake up stressed out and my anxiety only goes up from there. And you can see on the highlighted portion that their waking is actually at the low end of normal, and then they skyrocket near the top of the gray shaded reference range, and then they are outside of the reference range with the big red arrow. And then she said to me, I'm really tired in the afternoon. And I said, well, it's perceived tired. Believe it or not, your afternoon point is in the reference range, but your fall from the morning to the afternoon is a pretty big crash. So you really perceive it as a crash. You're used to running on high octane, high levels of high octane all morning. And then when you come down into the normal range, the perception is that's a big drop. It is a big drop, but the body's like, oh, I'm tired. So you don't actually have low cortisol. We just need to balance out the CAR in the morning. The practitioner on the right said to me, Carrie, I need 8 cups of coffee to get going in the morning. I hit snooze all the time. I, can't get motivated, can't get going. And oh, by the way, she has Hashimoto. She said my Hashimoto symptoms have gotten a lot worse. And I looked at her result. Again, the gray shaded areas where she should be, and she is the yellow highlighted black line below the gray shaded area for her cortisol awakening response. So no wonder she needed 8 cups of coffee, and no wonder she felt like her Hashimoto's was a lot worse. Because as I said earlier, in relation to the thymus gland, that her cells that are failing central tolerance are not getting destroyed maybe as well as they should. And in my mind, those cells just sneak out, right? Like if nothing's triggering them to be killed, then they just sneak out and go out into circulation. And we don't want inappropriate cells sneaking out and going into circulation. So let's start with an elevated cortisol awakening response. Why would this be high? Everything we've talked about: anxiety, panic, fear, hypervigilance on waking or close thereafter, anticipatory stress for the day. If your patient woke up in acute pain, acute inflammation, or acute infection, if a stressful event happened first thing in the morning, so if their dog threw up when they woke up, if they woke up late, if they woke up and read their phone and it was a stressful text message, their kid has a fever, this all can just skyrocket the cortisol awakening response. However, please check in with them. Is this their normal? If your patient says, well, it's always something. If it's not my dog, it's my kid. If it's not my kid, it's my spouse. If it's not my spouse, it's my boss. If it's not my boss, it's my sister. Like it's always something, then this is their normal morning. It's just the acute stressor is different. If they drank caffeine or took stimulants in the morning, which we don't recommend for testing, at the point of testing, we want to see their baseline. But if they did anyhow, then that's them on caffeine or stimulants. Depression, I said earlier, melancholic depression has a higher cortisol awakening response, but again, due to that serotonin decrease, it's not a why. Depression doesn't cause the high CAR causes the depression. And then ovulation. So if she is testing just her cortisol awakening response, and it happens to be around ovulation, everything goes up at ovulation, right? Like estrogen's up, then LH is up, then progesterone's up, testosterone goes up, everything goes up. So cortisol does as well. All the signaling pulses tend to increase for women around ovulation. It's mixed research, but it is interesting. Any elevated response, please consider doing it within the first 30 minutes of waking for maximum impact. Anything you do, any kind of treatment therapy suggestion in the first 30 minutes, because that's when the CAR is doing its thing, right? So how do you address an elevated response? Seek therapy if needed, 100%. Please seek it out. Seek social connection, of course, from 6 feet away. Call, video chat your friends and families. Laying visual eyes on people, they're showing in research, is really making a difference as opposed to just calling and hearing their voice on the phone. It makes you feel less isolated. Meditation, breath work, journaling, yoga, heart math, respirate, the emotional freedom technique. Any of these things can be done sitting in bed within the first 30 minutes of waking. Grounding exercises, shaking exercises, vagal nerve exercises, increasing oxytocin, and be careful of EMF exposure. I know the whole EMF thing is very controversial, but I believe it can be triggering. It can be stimulating to the HPA-Axis, especially for people who sleep with their computers and their tablets and their phones all right around their head. And just for a stress response, just be aware of being on the phone at first thing on waking, reading the news, right? Reading about social media, looking at text messages that could cause that initial spike. Focus on the grounding, relaxing stuff first, and then move into that. So what are these exercises I'm talking about? Grounding, I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with when it comes to walking barefoot in the grass or on the sand. So there's physical grounding that you can do. And then there's mental grounding that you can do. So the physical grounding are like touching the natural elements, washing your hands in cold water, which oddly is everybody's new normal right now. But they show in research that when you're very anxious and you're up in your head and you're nervous and you can't come down, that using cold water, holding an ice cube, anything that can break that sensation for you, or introducing a new sensation, will help bring the anxiety down. Taking a walk, putting on fun music and feeling the rhythm, or dancing. The mental grounding is keeping yourself in reality. So repeating centering statements like, my name is, centering factual statements and just repeating it. My name is Carrie Jones. Today is Wednesday. Believe it or not, it's April Fool's as I do this webinar. I live in Portland, Oregon. My favorite color is turquoise blue. And just keep repeating it over and over, because that's reality versus what anxiety is making them feel, and is not usually the reality. Other things are like math problems, count backwards by 7. It's hard to be anxious when you're trying to subtract 7 from 100, from 93, from 86, from 79. Yes, I had to pull a calculator out to do that. But just to give you an example. Shaking exercises are my new favorite thing. Shaking exercises are used a lot in like shamanic work and Kundalini yoga. For a lot of therapists are integrating shaking exercises, and I want you to be like Taylor Swift and literally shake it off. It's the easiest thing in the world. Think about how animals shake after a stress or a fright. Even like if you've ever watched dogs playing, they'll play rough, and then they'll shake afterwards, and then go back to playing or walk around or sniff or go to the bathroom. And that shake response is what helps close the loop. It helps close the fight, flight, freeze loop and let it go. So I tell people, just shake out your hands. Just imagine like, you've got your hands are wet and you just need to get them dry, and just shake them like that. Shake out your arms. Shake out your legs, stand up and twist back and forth while shaking out your arms. Bounce on the balls of your feet while shaking out your body. This isn't a slow rhythmic thing. This isn't like, just swaying back and forth at a concert. This, like, you're shaking. You've got to get some movement. Shake the water off, shake the stress off. And it has made a huge world of difference for a lot of people. And it's easy and can be done at home. What stimulates the vagus nerve? So many things. End your shower in cold water. Dip your face in cold water. Singing, laughing, chanting, humming loudly, gargle. The Valsalva maneuver, which is why holding your breath and bearing down. That's not my favorite one, but I do put it on here. Meditation, anything that addresses the gut, because the vagus nerve, of course, goes right down to the gut and back up to the brain. Yoga, rhythmic breathing, so doing the 4 squared breathing, which is where you're in for 4, hold for 4, out for 4, hold for 4, or the other breathing where you're breathing for 4 or 6, hold for 7, out for 8, do it again. So there's a lot of really neat rhythmic breathing that you can do. And then laying on the right side affects the vagus as it goes by the liver. So that's the vagus nerve. And then we have the oxytocin. So what increases oxytocin? That, if you're watching on screen, that's my dog Hank. So you're welcome. I've just increased your oxytocin. So physical touch, hugging, kissing, cuddling those you love, including pets. Words of encouragement and appreciation. So you guys, you're doing an amazing job right now. All of you healthcare practitioners, I'm so proud of you. Being on the front lines, listening to this whole webinar, and really, really, really wanting to change the world and heal the world. So I appreciate you. There, your oxytocin just went up. That you're looking at my dog Hank, so you're good. Genuine laughing, meditation, prayer, eat, drink, and be merry, and of course, breastfeeding. So we're going to go through treatments. In the interest of time, I know that this is going to be a little longer than an hour because we're still going to get through the low stuff. I have a lot of data on each slide, which, as you know, you will be getting the PDF copy of. So I can't go through all of the data, but I wanted to make sure you had it for good reference. So general support, quality multivitamin, extra B vitamins, think of like B5 for the adrenals, B6 for GABA. Vitamin C, humans cannot make their own vitamin C. We need it. It's a great antioxidant used directly right in the adrenal glands. And we know right now vitamin C is so critical for antiviral support. Magnesium for GABA, it raises BDNF, which I have a slide on, and inhibits NMDA receptors, so those glutamate receptors, and essential fatty acids. GABA support itself, taking GABA, pregnenolone, like progesterone, like oral or sublingual progesterone, will convert into ALLO, A-L-L-O, which supports your GABA-A receptors. L-theanine, which is one of my most favorite, inhibits your glutamate receptors, increases BDNF. Your 5-HTP, your tryptophan, and your taurine is amino acids, or kind of amino acids. So please keep in mind, if you're giving patients 5-HTP, please don't deplete their dopamine. Remember, the rate limiting step is there to make serotonin and to make dopamine. So if you're just pushing 5-HTP over and over and over again, don't deplete their dopamine. You may want to also give them some tyrosine or L-Dopa at the same time, or after a couple weeks or a month, to help that dopamine. Your calming herbs, this is specifically for your 11-beta HSD1. Do I have a note? I do that. Yep. Magnolia, your Ziziphus, and your skullcap. So on the Dutch test, they're on page 6 of the Dutch Plus. There is a little gauge that tells you if they're leaning towards cortisol or leaning towards cortisone. If they're leaning towards cortisol, that's the 11-beta HSD1 enzyme that's doing that. And Magnolia, Ziziphus, and skullcap can help inhibit. Your calming, we've got chamomile, your milky oats, which is avena, your passion flower, which we know has been compared to your benzos as an anxiolytic, your maca, which has been shown to potentially reduce ACTH and thus cortisol, and your hemp-derived CBD. Your adaptogens, look at ashwagandha, just be careful if they have Graves or hyperthyroidism. Siberian ginseng, your rhodiola. Be careful though, rhodiola can be really stimulating for some people. If they're already stimulated, this may be too much, but for others, it's not as stimulating. The great thing about rhodiola, though, is it does increase your SIRT1, your SIRT2-in-1, which is really anti-aging, good for infection, inflammation. Increases heat shock protein 70, and possibly raises BDNF. And then holy basil, which is my most favorite in the whole world. We have your cordyceps, your shashandra, your bacopa, which is a great one for the brain. I often start with bacopa for the brain, especially reducing brain inflammation and increasing BDNF. So speaking of BDNF, just a couple quick slides. BDNF, for those who don't know, it's brain-derived neurotrophic factor, very important for neuronal survival and development, protects against glutamate toxicity. When it comes to BDNF, there are a number of natural substances, herbs, what have you, that are being linked to helping to support increase BDNF to various degrees, which I have here on the slide, and the study is linked, which is why as you go through my slides on BDNF, I have listed. The reason some of them have question marks is just because of the number of studies on them. So for example, Panax ginseng has the most number of studies relating it to increasing BDNF, whereas Eleutherococcus senticosus has the least amount of studies. It doesn't mean it doesn't raise BDNF, it's just the number of studies out there are not very robust. And so just keeping that in mind when you're looking. What else increases BDNF? Exercises, specifically strength training and HIIT, deep sleep, intermittent fasting or caloric restriction, regular enjoyable socializing. Unfortunately, social isolation decreases BDNF, so a lot of people are experiencing social isolation right now, and we want to improve this through chat, through check-ins, through email, through social media, through whatever. Zinc, magnesium threonate, my favorite, omega-3 fatty acids, DHEA, niacin, and magnolia again, which also reduces 11-beta HSD1, but will increase BDNF. So great, yay magnolia. So we want to improve sleep function. These are all the basics with your patients. Everything's either they're hyperstimulated, right? So avoiding blue light, white light 1 to 2 hours before bed. The melanopsin in our eyes is what registers your blue-green light, and the blue-green light is what suppresses melatonin. So we want to make sure that we're avoiding that blue-green light. Avoiding alcohol and sugar before bed, avoiding caffeine, stimulatory exercise, work on winding down. We want to sleep in a cool room temperature if we can. Consider a sleep study for those with apnea or disordered breathing, snoring, mouth breathers, and evaluate other factors for sleeping. So what's going on with your animals in your room, your partner, your children, noises, mold in the bedroom, other light sources in the bedroom like night lights and alarm clocks and stuff. Those can all be an issue. Now let's finish up with low cortisol awakening response. So why would somebody have a low response? Well, unfortunately, excessive amounts of psychological burnout. Sleep deprivation, sleep apnea, disordered breathing. This can cause a low CAR. Traumatic brain injury or any damage to the hypothalamus, pituitary, or hippocampus. The hippocampus in particular controls the CAR. Chronic pain, HPA causes HPA downregulation over time. PTSD, seasonal affective disorder, poor HPA communication, fluorescent lights, and suppressive medications. These are all things you're just going to check in with in your patients to figure out what rabbit hole you need to go down. And just remember that feedback loop. You may be seeing somebody who over time is getting a decrease in cortisol. They had high cortisol maybe 6 months ago, a year ago, 2 years ago. And remember, this is could be in the future too. You may be seeing them in 2025. And 5 years prior, during the 2020 coronavirus, they had really high cortisol, and now it's really low. So just always keep this feedback loop in mind when you see low cortisol. With suppressive medications, please ask about steroid medications. This time of year in the Northern Hemisphere, it's allergies. So your steroid inhalers, your steroid nasal sprays, right? Oral pills like prednisone, topical creams people are using for itches and, rashes and whatever they get, they're putting that steroid cream on. Opioid pain medications, substance abuse does tend to go up in extremely stressful times like this. So people may be turning to opioids here and there to help with their pain, to help with sleep, or unfortunately to numb out. Accutane has been shown in some research to suppress the HPA-Axis, which is isotretinoin. And some research says larger doses of aspirin, 300 to 600 milligrams, has been shown to decrease ACTH. So if you see low cortisol, ask them about their aspirin use. The research did not look at daily baby aspirin. It was a high dose, 300 to 600 milligrams is what they were looking at. Would a baby aspirin suppress cortisol? If they're on a baby aspirin every day with low cortisol, it's entirely possible it's contributing. Again, with any response, the CAR is active in the first 30 minutes. So whatever you do it within the first 30 minutes for maximum impact. And always, always, always address their sleep, because their sleep is what helps set off the proper CAR in the morning. So again, we're looking at seeking therapy, social connection, all the stuff, shaking, grounding, vagal, oxytocin, emotional freedom technique support. It all applies here as well. They're going to just pick something and do it within the first 30 minutes to support them. You're going to start with the brain because that's where the communication starts to release the cortisol out of the adrenals. You're going to do something called HPA retraining, which is what I've been saying for years, which is basically where you want to get them up in the morning and down at night. You're retraining that circadian rhythm. You're going to talk about the adaptogens, the nutrients, and the brain support. We're going to use light therapy and consider light movement or exercise on waking. So if it all starts with the brain, you want to follow a strict circadian rhythm. You're going to get their gut healthy, of course, and work on the vagus nerve, and you're going to improve blood flow and oxygenation to the brain. So how do you do that first? How do you improve blood flow and oxygenation? Exercise. I know they're at home. Get them exercising. Have them do cardio, weights. If they're into yoga, doing inversion poses. Stopping smoking. Work with them on their blood sugar, because as we know, the blood sugar, high blood sugar will kind of, gums up the works, gums up the capillaries. Look at things like neurofeedback, biotuning, cranial sacral work, energy medicine. Obviously, I know these things can't be done in the first 30 minutes, but it could be a really helpful part of their plan, especially if they've had like a traumatic brain injury or something like major trauma on top of what's going on right now. This can just be part of their monthly or every other week type of therapy that they do. Acupuncture, chiropractic, massage, lymphatic stimulation really help the tight upper back, the upper shoulders, right? The traps, the neck. Those of you who've got your shoulders up around your ears right now, pull them down. Stretch out your neck, stretch out your head, right? Move your back a little bit, move your shoulders out. You got to really improve that blood flow. Your hormones ride around in your circulatory system, right? So let's keep it flowing. Those of you who love to do or have increase hyperbaric oxygen therapy, your HBOT, especially post-traumatic brain injury, really helpful for increasing oxygen levels. Test them for iron overload, notice hemochromatosis. These iron deposits can affect brain function, so pay really close attention to ferritin and iron levels in men and women. And then, of course, again, reducing EMF and cell phone exposure to the head. Just we know that at least in rats, although, let's be honest, it can have an effect on neuron transmission and increasing brain temperature, and can really affect hormones. So with the brain supplements, again, we're looking at Bacopa. This applies to high or low because it helps Bacopa specifically improve cognition, reduces hyperactivity, increases attention, increases BDNF, reduces brain inflammation. Who doesn't want that? Cordyceps, omega-3 fatty acids, and rosemary. You guys, rosemary has cognitive enhancing powers. It increases NRF2. It protects against LPS damage. It's anti-inflammatory. It increases my favorite neurotransmitter called acetylcholine. But be careful with rosemary. It will suppress iron absorption from the gut. So tonight, use rosemary, smell rosemary, grow rosemary, have rosemary tea. It can be really helpful. Look at your ginkgo again. Look at your PQQ. PQQ is really important to protect NMDA receptors. It's important for mitochondrial health. It reduces C-reactive protein, which is C-reactive protein can actually, high C-reactive protein can actually lead to leptin resistance. So your leptin resistant people, check their C-reactive protein. Maca again. Now it says reduces ACTH and thus cortisol. So you might think it's counterintuitive, but maca can be quite an adaptogen. So it's nutritive for people with low cortisol as well. Just the study I was showing does show in that instance it was reducing ACTH. I do use maca though with low cortisol people and tend to have great success. The low response general suggestions are still the same: B vitamins, vitamin C, magnesium, essential fatty acids. But now I'm looking at mitochondrial health, because why? Cortisol is made in the mitochondria using the endoplasmic reticulum as well of your adrenal cells. So mitochondrial health is really important to make cortisol. So here are some examples of cofactors, transporters, and antioxidants, right? CoQ10, L-carnitine, alpha-lipoic acid, glutathione, and acetylcysteine. B vitamins, NADH, essential fatty acids, curcumin, PQQ, and intermittent fasting. Getting full sun or light exposure are the first thing on waking. So when it comes to light, we want to make sure that we're going to actually skip this. We're going to go just to this natural daylight versus fluorescent light. So be very careful with the kind of lighting that you have. And then, of course, we get into our adaptogens again: ashwagandha, Siberian ginseng, rhodiola, cordyceps, schisandra, bacopa, I mentioned already, your panax, and your licorice, which are much more stimulating, which is why I have them here in the low carb part. And then those of you who use glandulars, Love glandulars. There is limited clinical research, unfortunately, but I do prescribe glandulars for those with really low vitality and then retest after about 3 to 4 months. So in conclusion, remember, practitioner, heal thyself. Try not to be Cruella. Try and excel in your career, maintain a social life from 6 feet away. Drink enough water, exercise, text everyone back, stay sane, survive, socially isolate, and be happy. And in summary, we know that fear, anxiety response heavily impacts resilience, stress, blood sugar, inflammation, autoimmune. And we know that the CAR collection are 3 saliva samples in the first 60 minutes. It's more data points, more collection, but more helpful to having your patient thrive in their environment. The treatment considerations are not difficult, but the timing is everything. Remember your grounding, your shaking, your vagal, and your oxytocin exercises. Remember your sun, in the morning. Get off your phone, your computer, your tablet at night, wear your blue light blocking glasses, and sleep will probably fix greater than 50% of your CAR issues. Lastly, pet a dog. It increases oxytocin, it reduces stress, it induces parasympathetic happiness and joy. So just the last slides before we are finished up here. Remember, with Dutch, we have the Dutch Complete, which is dried urine only, the Dutch Plus, which we talked about. We also talked about the Dutch CAR only, and we didn't have enough time to talk about, but we do offer a cycle mapping for those women who need to look at the hormones all throughout their cycle, especially if they have symptoms throughout their cycle related to hormones and they can't figure it out. If you're interested, if you're new to Dutch, please contact customer service at that number, or you can go to that web address. New accounts receive 50% off up to 5 kits when you sign up. So we do have a special for you. We do have a discount for you. So please definitely contact us. We're happy to help. And no, we do drop ship right to your patients. So you do not have to carry kits in your office right now. We offer free shipping in the United States. You can place your drop ship orders through your portal, or you can call Dutch directly and we can ship it out to your patient for you. So you can maintain your telemedicine practice, but keep with the social distancing. So we're here to help you. Next webinar is April 15th. Please sign up. You will get information about this with Dr. Deborah Matthew. She's discussing functional endocrinology testing, why she measures urine cortisol. And then I follow up on April 29th, going through case studies, patterns, and pearls, specifically about the HPA-Axis. So you will get more through Dutch. And that concludes our talk. Thank you so much for listening. I'm not actually sure if I think we have a minute for questions.
I think we do. We've got a little bit of time for some questions. So let me throw those at you, Carrie. What causes weight loss when in acute stress period? Low cortisol?
Oh, no, norepinephrine. Norepinephrine affects the brown fat, and for a short term can lead to weight loss. So like now, a lot of people are losing weight now, or going through divorce or illness. It's actually the norepinephrine-epinephrine effect on your brown fat. So it's a different mechanism. Good question.
Okay, and is there any way to tell the problems are rooted in hypothalamus or in pituitary from the Dutch Plus result?
So if everything is really concerningly low, then we may suggest to you, like, yes, you should probably run some, like ACTH, right? Like maybe you should run an ACTH. And if it does look as a disease state, we may suggest to you looking at Cushing's or Addison's, depending what the cortisol level is. But we may suggest a morning ACTH to you, just as a blood screener, and you can use that in conjunction with the Dutch Plus results.
Great. Should a cortisol test be done without adaptogens or phosphatidylserine in the system to get an accurate reading?
So if you want to know if it's working, keep your patients on them. Please keep in mind the effect of them lasts a while. So if you've had them on ashwagandha for several months and you decide you want them to go off because you want a baseline, it might take several weeks to a month or more to have the effect wear off, right? From the what it's done to correct the HPA-Axis. So it may not actually be helpful to you because you don't want to wait a month. You don't want to wait 6 weeks to see if the effect wears off or not. The effect may not wear off and it lasts. So most of the time I tell people, and adaptogens, just stay on them, and let's see if they're working.
Okay. Could you speak on possible causes of high DHEA in those with PCOS found with Dutch and salivary test? Any ideas on how to reduce DHEA?
Yes, so DHEA goes up for a couple of reasons. One, insulin will stimulate it. So especially with insulin-based PCOS, that's a big androgen stimulator out of the theca cells, of which DHEA can be made in the theca cells. Cortisol, it'll go up to protect the brain, believe it or not, from the damaging effects of cortisol. And so those are kind of the two areas that I look when I see somebody with high DHEA. I really like DHEA. DHEA, I think, and the majority of my research is rather protective to the human body. The problem is when it starts to become really androgenic, and nobody likes that. Nobody wants the male pattern baldness. Nobody wants acne or hirsutism or anger or aggression, but it is being increased to, from what I can tell, to actually help protect the body. So lower their insulin and address their cortisol.
Okay. Can you speak to stress in pregnancy and how it affects the amygdala?
That's a great question. Unfortunately, I am not the expert in that. So I am not a midwife or an OBGYN. And so actually in pregnancy, that I don't know the concrete research on. But that is a really good question as far as like natal development.
Okay. This will be our last one. People with PTSD tend to have a lot of hypervigilance.
Yes.
Isn't this high cortisol surges and not just solely a low cortisone response?
It's not a low cortisol response. It's this, the cortisol awakening response is lower compared to somebody who doesn't have PTSD. So and remember, cortisol is not the only hormone that can be set off. So we're talking about the cortisol awakening response in PTSD, but their norepinephrine, epinephrine release may be much more triggered compared to somebody else. And their amygdala may be more, of course, has been conditioned very quickly to respond with a fear-based emotion immediately. So it's not just cortisol that plays into PTSD. It is the other hormones you have to take into account as well. But that's a really good question. I used to think PTSD was high cortisol, and it's not always the case. It's the other hormones are typically elevated.
All right, everyone. I do have some additional questions that were recorded, and we will also send those answers out to you tomorrow. Just a reminder, we're going to send the webinar recording to everybody, as well as the slides. And we hope we see you with us Wednesday, April 15th. Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Dr. Jones.